Hello and good evening, my name is Morganon, and in case you missed the news, ELEX II had a surprise announcement a couple weeks ago. Very surprising, a lot of people are still unaware of the fact, and since then I've been trying to get this video together, mostly in note form, and every time a new piece of media or news comes out, or a preview or something, I kind of have to go back and change it, because some revelations in that information overrule some of the speculation I had in the original script. So basically I'm reading off a script that I pretty much put together last night. So bear with me, there might be a lot of things I missed, but really wanted to get this video out there while the news was still fresh. And by fresh I mean it's 2 weeks old, so that's getting a little manky. Anyway, my original plan was basically to review every piece of media from the original release trailer to the first GameStar preview to the screenshots and that sort of thing, but everything started coming out so quickly that would just get unwieldy. And again, some of the stuff that showed up later kind of overwrites some of the original, perhaps, misconceptions that I had in the original information. So instead, we're going to break down the what we know by topics and fill in the blanks with some of my own speculation based on what I've been seeing. So, off the bat, probably the most important thing to talk about is the story. From what we hear, Piranha Bytes will sort of assume certain choices that the players would have made in the first game. As we know, there were multiple endings in the first game, mostly based on your morality value, your cold versus emotional value. There were 3 different outcomes depending on that, mostly defining Jax's relationship with the hybrid. Whether or not we actually killed him, whether we tried to convert him to our side, or instead saw reason with his perspective and took his side instead. Apparently, Piranha Bytes determined somehow that 90% of players basically got the same outcome. And I call bullshit on that, because I'm 100% convinced that they just could not invest the time required to make the story of ELEX II adaptable to our choices in the first game, basically importing your save profile and making sure that the story actually has some tangible differences. We all remember kind of how that came to be a whole load of nothing in the Mass Effect trilogy and the classic Telltale game formula. But in my opinion, if that's how they're going to roll with it, then they really shouldn't bother making multiple endings and outcomes if the sequels are just going to establish one as canon. And I really cannot imagine that they had some kind of, unless it had some undisclosed data sharing from people's ELEX save games, but I doubt that's the case. I think that they are just interpreting from feedback which outcomes people like the most, and probably getting that feedback from forum posts and videos and that kind of thing, if they're even bothering watching all that. Regardless, what we know is that after the events of the first game, Jax went to warn the world and all the factions about the threat revealed to him by the hybrid, but apparently nobody believes him, and this alone disagrees with every outcome we saw of the first game, since other than getting the true cold ending, at least both the Berserkers and Clerics seem to take your warning seriously.
Then time will be our enemy. We must begin our preparations. You have shown us that we can overcome challenges if we work together. You will inspire us in the challenges to come. We will need your strength if we are to defend our planet. I hope to be able to stand at your side when the time comes.
So it really kind of seems like a stretch that they, just for the sake of conflict, they're gonna make all the factions disbelieve Jax in order to give him something to do, in order to start leading the fight against the invaders. So far, really, the information we're hearing gives me the sense of heavy retcons, and that's kind of appropriate. In some cases, people have been referring to ELEX II as the Gothic II of ELEX, so that precedent's kind of already set there. Gothic II had a lot of retcons over the first game, kind of changed how the ending worked, and also kind of assumed a lot of characters were not killed over the course of the game. So I guess since his warnings were unheeded, Jax gets frustrated and pisses off into self-imposed exile for 6 years, and only returns when the threat finally arrives. So it's hard to believe that anybody will be remotely prepared, since nobody planned for this to be a reality. They all just blew him off, carried on with their own petty squabbles, as it were. But in other news, Jax apparently had a son. And yes, there will actually be children in the game. More on that a little bit later. So that gives me the impression that maybe his exile was really just him dodging child support payments. It's not clear who the canon romance will be with, as both Kaya and Nasty are going to be returning, based on what we've seen in footage and screenshots, and either one of them was a romance option in the first game. So part of the story with Jax coming out of exile will involve him trying to reconnect with his son, and I think it'll be interesting to know exactly how old his son was when he pissed off. Small little detail at the end of the original CGI announcement trailer gives some ominous foreshadowing on how that might turn out, however. Apparently Jax became a couch potato in exile, as he will be back to square one and need to get his skills and attributes back. There doesn't seem to be a very significant excuse for why that is, not like being buried under a subterranean temple for 3 weeks. But we'll see how that plays out. The alien species in certain media has been referred to as Skyanides, which has to be one of the worst puns I've ever heard in my life. Maybe it's not the real name, maybe it's just a bad translation from German sources, but it's hard to imagine that it is. The concept of Dark ELEX is introduced with a fancy new purple color. It's not clear yet how that will function differently in-game, if it'll be an acquirable item, if it's used the same in terms of currency and narcotic purposes, but normal ELEX will still exist in its previous functions, although the cold and emotional states don't exist anymore, being replaced with a different morality system, so not sure how that's going to affect that. The morality system will instead be based on the concepts of creation and destruction, where violent acts push you towards destruction. So there's demonstrations in one of the gameplay videos where killing non-violent animals raises your destruction value, and I would assume that attacking friendly NPCs will also do the same thing, and possibly dialogue choices that result in violent outcomes. How creation's going to work, on the other hand, is not really apparent, nor how the morality system will affect the story and the gameplay. Apparently the factions will be going through some major changes, but so far we can only really speculate on how much. The German media site and channel PC Games confirms that there will be a total of 5 factions to join this time around, rather than the classic 3. Maybe this is not as clear-cut as it sounds, because there's not a whole lot of details yet. A lot of the promo art still seems to prominently feature 3 factions, and we also hear that a special 6th faction will play a particular role, but details on that are scarce. Doesn't seem that we will be joining them, but they will have some role to play in the story, and possibly have some skills and resources to offer, or perhaps it's a secret join the enemy sort of alternative story arc with its own ending. Could be interesting, but we'll have to wait and see. The Berserkers seem to have taken over the fort in Tavar from the Outlaws. Most curiously, we see the character Rat referred to as a Warlord. Warlords being the highest rank in the Berserker hierarchy. There are only 3 of them in the first game, so this scheming little rodent apparently not only found his way up the ranks into Logan's hierarchy with the Outlaws, but managed to transition that experience over to the Berserkers somehow. So we don't know yet how the Berserkers managed to take over the fort. The dialogue seems to suggest that the factions have not merged, but are still in fact in conflict. The Outlaws prominently feature in a lot of promo art, so they still exist. And the Outlaws are still in conflict with the Berserkers, but maybe when the Berserkers took over the fort, they won over some former Outlaws who swore fealty to them to avoid being massacred. It also seems from the art and the appearance of the Berserkers that they are a little bit less stringent on their rules on modern technology. Some of the characters in the promo art are seen using jetpacks, and their armor itself seems to have more modern trappings associated with it. We get a couple glimpses of the Outlaws. It seems to indicate a new leadership. We haven't seen this fellow in the trailer before, I'm assuming at any rate, because it's not unlike Piranha Bytes to completely redesign characters between games, but it doesn't appear to be Logan, and in 2 of the 3 endings, if I recall, Logan will actually attack you and can be killed. So maybe they're assuming that that was the case, or this could be an indication that the enigmatic Bloody Baxter made his comeback. We know that he was running and hiding from Logan after Logan's takeover of the fort, so perhaps during the whole conflict with the elves, he took his opportunity. It almost seems that they have a lot more advanced technology going into their sort of ramshackle appearance in roughshod weapons and everything. Especially the armor that the leader himself appears to be wearing looks a little bit more clean and sci-fi, more like the cleric armor than any of them appeared to have before. We even see some bizarre-looking mutants, I'm assuming, with a lot of advanced-looking armor strapped onto them. So I'm wondering if the outlaws perhaps at some point were able to get one over on the clerics and end up stripping some of their technology for their own ends. Could be an interesting concept. The clerics, we know, were kind of on the ropes in the first game. In spite of their advanced technology, their influence was waning. They were getting pushed back into their Hort in Ignadon. I guess this raises a question on what happened in the Dome City. In my playthrough, at least, I only saw the outcome where the clerics essentially ended up massacring the outlaw revolt and pretty much dominating the city on their own. But perhaps the canon ending will be very different. If I recall, when we led the clerics on the attacks onto the converters in Abessa, they lost a large number of men and in fact couldn't even participate in the final assault on the fortress in... I don't even remember the name of the place at this point. The snow place where the Alps were hanging out. So it's possible that after all of their setbacks over the years, they were no match for the outlaws leading their assault. Who knows? A lot of speculation there, can't really speak to anything. But it's really unclear so far if the clerics will be making their return as a playable faction. Some of the armor designs that we see in screenshots look familiar to them, and one of them is in fact titled with the name Cleric. So that seems to indicate that they are still around in some capacity, but whether they're one of the 5 joinable factions, we'll have to wait and see. The Albs seem to be returning in some capacity, perhaps it's just a separatist. The character in the CGI trailer may be the separatist leader Sestak, or in fact could even be Jax's father Wardek, but it's hard to tell whether they're all a bunch of pale, bald twats, so remains to be seen. In terms of recurring characters and party members, we know that Nasty is going to be making a return appearance, but no idea if she will be a follower. Meanwhile, Kaya can be seen as a follower in one of the gameplay videos, even though this could only be for the sake of a quest. Who knows if it's a permanent follower, but there's really no information on whether or not the party mechanic will work the same. So that's most of the story details we got. In terms of the setting, the world itself will apparently consist of half new locations and half old locations that'll see some significant changes over the course of 6 years, which is the amount of time that Jax was supposedly in exile. The total surface area of the game will be roughly the same size as the first, so it's not going to be a larger landmass in total. Tavar, the former desert, is looking more lively now that the Berserkers have gotten to work on it. I guess their world hearts are doing their job, and a lot of green and color has come back to the desert. But in terms of wasteland locations, 2 new locations that we've heard of include Morcon and Caracas.
He was in the arena when all hell broke loose.
And? How was it? What did he say?
Caracas itself was also mentioned in the previous game as an area that Baxter was hiding in, so supposedly Caracas was also the area where Jax went into exile, so perhaps that'll be our starting location this time around. One of the new locations, not clear which one yet, includes some actual urban environments with skyscrapers and the like. Unfortunately, it seems pretty obvious from the gameplay that we've seen that these buildings cannot actually be entered in any capacity. All we see is a character flying to the top of one. At one point, we get a glimpse of what looks to be a dark ELEX converter, but we don't get a good close-up view of it. Not sure who's running that one. Perhaps the Skyanides have resumed the extraction of ELEX that the Alps were starting. Almost makes me wonder if the Alps got the information on how to build these converters through some kind of communication with the alien invaders, but there's nothing to indicate that in the first game, so who knows. There looks to be one location that is much greener than Tavar is, so perhaps Edan will also be, or Abessa will also be a revisitable location, or maybe there's a whole new green area that we can explore. So that's it for the setting. That's about all we know so far. Probably the most important topic to go over is the gameplay and all the changes that we're seeing. Piranha has said that the gameplay of ELEX II is meant to be a refinement of what they started in ELEX I rather than trying to reinvent the wheel again. So there will be some significant changes to core gameplay concepts like combat and the jetpack for exploration. The jetpack itself will have a longer charge and actually allow for flight rather than slow, languid hovering this time around, and will actually be upgradable to allow for unlimited flight. As a consequence of this unlimited jetpack, mid-air combat will be a thing now, though in its current form it looks pretty janky and almost seems like it kinda takes care of itself. If we're looking at the couple seconds of mid-air combat we see in one of the videos, obviously can't see the inputs that it takes to do this, but it seems like the character, when you attack, just closes the gap on his own and pretty much just wipes out the enemies in a hit or two, and they don't really seem to be able to do much to defend themselves. And mid-air ranged combat still looks too powerful, arguably even more so if they don't give the AI any countermeasures like the first game had. Supposedly this is to be compensated with more airborne enemies, but doesn't really solve the question of how you balance this with the grounded enemies. One interesting thing to see is that the melee combat looks significantly sped up, at least for basic attacks, but the animations themselves still look really stiff and unpleasant, and the heavy attacks still have a ridiculous flourish and recovery animation that just seems completely unnecessary. There's no sign of the combo meter that the first game had, which honestly I wasn't really a huge fan of, and a quote from the PC Games video suggests that Piranha is trying to make the combat more fluid and less combo focused, so that's probably why they ditched that idea entirely. They seem to have added some kind of quick kick attack with unclear applications. Not sure if it's meant to be a guard break or just to stop an enemy in motion or something. It didn't really look like it was dealing a whole lot of damage. Good thing to note is that the stamina doesn't seem to wait as long to start refilling after your attacks end, which was one of the things that made combat really sluggish in the first game. It looks like there's still some kind of auto lock-on during combat of sorts, where the attacks will track to the enemy and focus, and you don't have complete freedom of movement. Maybe it's an option to disable it. Hopefully it is, because honestly the auto lock-ons have always been the biggest flaw in most of their combat systems, because it makes it more annoying to deal with multiple targets. The hitboxes look pretty shit right now. Quite frequently we can see hits landing before the animation even gets to the enemy, and that was one of the issues that I've seen in most of their games. Risen 3 was probably one of the biggest offenders, where the attack just seems to hit even when there's a mile of clearance. So hopefully that's something that is just a matter of refining the animations. Looks like the camera can be actually fixed behind the player character now during fights, instead of fully rotating around the character or only fixed during lock-on like it was in the first game. And this isn't something that they've had in a while. I'm a big fan if this is making a return, although I'm not generally a fan of over-the-shoulder perspectives in these games. There's other occasions where the camera seems to unlock and you can move around freely instead of strafing, so maybe there's a button to change camera modes on the fly, which probably is the best compromise if they want to keep the more conventional camera style while allowing for the fixed perspective that they used to have. The stamina itself may actually play some additional roles in combat. In one scene, we see an enemy taking hits, eventually runs out of stamina and gets knocked to the floor for several seconds. So wearing out an enemy's stamina may actually be a valid strategy. Seems like a finishing move might be performed on a downed enemy. There's one point where Jax thwacks an enemy on the ground, and the animation looks like he has to dislodge the weapon from him afterwards, so perhaps there's some high damage finishers on downed enemies that we can do now. Ranged combat is probably where I wanted to see the most changes, and so far I haven't really seen any. What we mainly see is the use of the plasma rifle, which is still pinpoint accurate single shots. I'm assuming that they increase the damage for the sake of the preview, because they're pretty much one-shotting every enemy. However, my biggest problem with it is that the AI barely reacts to getting shot. In ELEX I, the ranged combat was too easy because enemies would just run straight at you if they didn't have a ranged weapon, and even if they did, it was pretty easy to just bait their shots while strafing and never get hit. So ranged weapons were pretty much playing the game on easy mode. Haven't seen any sign of bows or the like other than in concept art, or explosive ammunition like grenades and grenade launchers and that sort of thing, which were way too strong in the first game because you would just keep enemies flat on their ass by blowing up grenades in their face every time they took a step. We only see a handful of enemies so far. Of course, we see some new flying enemies like these pterodactyl-looking things and some bloodfly-looking things. But we do see there are a couple recurring enemies like the forest barnacle trolls that were very present in Edan. We only get one glimpse of magic being performed, and it is a fire rain spell that is activated from the quick slot menu, which is similar to its use in the Risen games. And it visibly consumed mana or energy, whatever it's being called this time, but may actually have a cooldown or some other limitation. We can't really tell from what we see. Not yet clear if magic will exist as a main hand weapon as well. That was how it basically worked in Risen 3, which was something I wanted to see them explore a bit more, was having a main weapon form of magic, as well as support magic so you could pull using a quick bar activation. Seems like that might be the case here, but again, we haven't seen if, holding fireballs in your right hand will make a return as well. Another significant change is that character attributes will again have actual passive effects. So improving your strength, for example, will have a more tangible effect on your character. In the first game, upgrading strength really had no meaning until you got it high enough to equip a new weapon. So it's good to see a return to this, because upgrading your stats should actually feel like you're making progress with your character rather than putting a bunch of experience into wasted attributes that don't do anything until you make enough of an investment. So as we said above, child NPCs will exist in the game, but harming them will just straight up not be allowed. Immersion in this case is sacrificed for the sake of a PEGI 16 rating, and I can't really blame them on this. I mean, not many games have been brave enough to allow killing children, and I don't think they need to. Only Deus Ex really springs to mind, and I have no idea how they got away with it. The GameStar article seems to suggest that the dialogue mechanics will be a little more retro and less handholdy this time around. You can try and lie, cheat, or bluff characters with no guarantee that it won't bite you in the ass. So, that's something that's nice to see. A little more dynamic application of your personality and dialogue. So moving on to the visuals, which is another area where Piranha Bytes has always been in desperate need of work. The graphics do not seem to show any significant leap forward, but everything that we see is presumably still in an alpha or pre-alpha state, so improvements may yet be made. I felt that way last time when they announced ELEX with some gameplay footage, and I assumed that a lot of things were work in progress, but I never really saw any major improvements from the pre-alpha footage to release, so maybe grasping at straws to still hope for that. We don't see too many characters up close, but some of the features look a little more detailed, like hair and such, but a lot of the facial features and skin textures still look very plastic. So, hopefully that's also a work in progress. The texture quality in general seems to be on par with the first game, and in some cases is dreadfully below standard. Taking a look at this armor in particular, I don't really know how in 2021 we still get cloth textures that look like this. But again, maybe they'll be fixed by the time we see it for ourselves. The lighting system and the like will surely see some benefit from DirectX 12, but don't appear significantly better than the first game so far. I mean, I haven't really compared them side by side, but mostly I'm distracted by the texture bugs and light flickering in some of the footage, as well as LODs popping in and out correctly. These surely will be worked on. This is the kind of thing I can imagine is the sort of thing that they patch out as they implement more environments and textures. Supposedly nighttime will be a lot darker this time around, which is cool for atmosphere, but the player is supposed to have access to a flashlight. First game only had road flares available, and those barely did anything, so having some kind of actual permanent light source with a restricted visibility could make nighttime excursions a little more interesting. Not a big fan of the wasteland areas. They look very monotone, aka brown. And sure, that's to be expected from a wasteland deserted area, but I feel like a little bit more could have been done with them. More anomalous ELEX zones, for example, or toxic infestation of some kind. Don't just need to smear mud on everything and claim it's the post-apocalypse. I'm really hoping that the animations are not final. Again, I felt that way with the first game, and as far as I know, all of the ELEX I footage resembled how the animations would ultimately be. None of that seemed to be fixed by the time the game got released. So a lot of them right now genuinely look like placeholders, particularly the very basic melee attack, and some things like the jetpack really don't make much sense. I don't understand how you can fly sideways while the jets are still coming straight out behind you. And the jets aren't even coming out of the jetpack in this footage that we see here. It's pretty much coming out of his ass. Chronobytes made a point back before ELEX I came out that all of the animations were keyframed and not motion captured. Not really sure why it's a point of pride for them, other than that they're spending less money but doing a lot more work on it. And it looks like this game is basically going for the same strategy, so hopefully they work on it a little bit harder this time. That's all the major topics I have to discuss, so in terms of miscellaneous details, one of the things I noticed straight off the bat is that the English localization didn't appear to even try and bring back the original voice actors. Jax and Kaya both sound about 15 years younger and don't resemble their original voices much at all. But those are the only recurring characters that we've seen so far. Who knows who else got recast?
Let us in, Lothar. A man made into a monster by ELEX.
Fenris gave me his personal permission to go in. I'm the one who found the source of the outlaw propaganda.
You should look to the defenses of this place. They will be needed in the storm to come.
We hear a little bit of music in some of this gameplay footage, and it all sounds pretty similar to the first game. Probably another Bjorn Pankratz original soundtrack, and we'll probably end up reusing a lot of the music, honestly. It's pretty much what I expect. Can't say that the first game's soundtrack really resonated with me. I mean, it's functional in terms of atmosphere, but it's not something I've ever cared to listen to on my own time. You can hear it in the background of this video anyway. Chronobytes has said several times that they were really planning for a shorter marketing period this time around, a matter of months in fact. The release date is still not hinted, so there's a slight chance it may be released this year, but I wouldn't hold your breath on it. The website declares that this project was co-funded by the Creative Europe program of the EU, so apparently they got to keep that loan money they won back in 2017 before ELEX I even came out. Supposedly, this had come with a caveat that the game had to release in 2020, but the pandemic may have allowed them a generous postponement of that. But that might explain why this game had the allowance for such a long development time. Chronobytes has never taken this long, I think, since Gothic 1 to develop a game. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that has really translated to a good-looking product yet. I suppose it's possible that Chronobytes was working on a lot of fundamental technology, things that we won't really see on the surface level until we play it for ourselves, but that's given them a lot of benefit of the doubt. A quote from the GameStar preview states that ELEX II is supposed to, quote, expand instead of revolutionize. And that precedent is set. ELEX itself wasn't the revolution that it wanted to be, so some people might consider the reuse of locations, assets, and basic build as a cop-out, but Chronobytes always does better when building on a foundation that they started rather than starting from scratch. I mean, Gothic 3, Risen 2, and ELEX were full of flaws that their respective successors all really improved on. Quite an interesting note, the music in the trailer, the original CGI trailer, is apparently an original track from Jonathan Davis, the singer of Korn. Maybe that's where that 250,000 euro they got from the EU program went to. And there are some pretty bleak implications given by the lyrics at the end of the trailer that everything dies. So, well, we got that to look forward to. So one of the things I thought to do for this video was to kind of make a retrospective of the first game, but it's been so long since I played it that I don't have any fresh opinions on it. Didn't really give me a strong sense of immersion, attachment, or engagement. I played through it 3 times to try and get all 3 factions, and none of it really stuck in my memory all that strongly, so my expectations are not terribly high, which at least means they have more chance to impress by being above average. I can't really say any of the details we've learned on the story have gotten me re-engaged after finding the drama and plot twist of the first one, as well as the poorly implemented sort of culture clash between the factions to be pretty laughable. Hopefully they will at least make the enemy more compelling, since the Albs weren't really that interesting of an antagonist, and the hybrids' lack of significant presence or any meaning until the last few minutes of the game made it difficult to think much of them. But honestly, the odds are the alien species will just be the Independence Day type of alien, the we're here to just steal all your shit and blow you up kind of aliens. The only plot thread that I'm actually interested and want to see to conclusion is the subplot we had in the first game with Kaya's connection to ELEX, and how she interpreted it as a sentient thing of sorts. How ELEX is being affected by being transmuted to mana and that sort of thing. So how we see it modified into Dark ELEX, and whether or not it actually has a conscience of its own, it could be an interesting thread to follow if they decide to go anywhere with it. The glimpses of combat and gameplay in general that I've seen don't give me a strong sense it'll be that big of an improvement, but a lot will depend on the AI and animations improving, so hopefully that's something they're working on. I would have to assume that the AI difficulty was turned way down for the demos, but all the janky, hard-to-read animations and unreliable hitboxes are really what spoiled the first game for me the most, and AI probably a close second. New features like the mid-air melee combat seem like a big potential misfire, and what I've seen so far does not give me high expectations. I really didn't find the three factions of the first game to be their most engaging out of all their games, and despite their conflicts in certain areas, all of them seem to exist with no real relation or connection to each other. Not to mention that the unique abilities that they each provided were pretty spotty. Outlaws, above all, really had nothing compelling to offer in terms of skills, and they're frankly rather useless ELEX drugs that they were making, which is supposed to be the whole selling point. So now that we have 5 factions to choose from instead of 3, it makes me concerned that they all be worse off and even more shallow for it. But maybe their writers had a lot of free time in quarantine to actually work on these characters and stories this time. Well, for now, that's all I really have to say about what we've seen. I'm sure we'll see even more information trickle out in the weeks to come, but I probably won't have the time to make a video for every single one that we get to see. So at any rate, I'm still here, still sitting in this chair making YouTube videos, and certainly expect to play this once it comes out. So in spite of my critiques and reservations, rest assured I'm not going to brush this one off. So stay tuned for more videos as we see more interesting details emerge from the THQ Nordic marketing machine. Otherwise, hope you're all staying safe, staying healthy, and we'll see you next time.